Coming up on this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society. Next, Jenny, I got your number 8675309. It's dangerous to go alone, so the Nintendo Cartridge Society goes with you. Welcome to Nintendo Cartridge Society. My name is Patrick Ellers, and I am joined, as I am always joined by my co-host, Mark Mitchell. Mark, how's it going?
It's going great, although I have to admit, Patrick, I am reaching the point where I am forgetting what my hair looked like when it was properly coiffed, like when a professional had touched it in months, because it doesn't look that way right now, but I'm just kind of getting used to it. Like, this is just when you've been doing it for half a year or more, that's just kind of what your hair is now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is time that we all recognize that we are not in a weird interim period in our lives. These just these are our lives now. This is what this is. We live existences where we see the same three rooms all day, every day, forever. This is it. It'll change, but this is what life is now. And this is what your hair is now, Mark. Honestly, I don't remember either.
I know, that's the thing, is that for a while it was upsetting, and now it's just life is normal.
Yeah, that's right. It's I've been thinking about a lot how I spend so much time with Sarah now, which I am very lucky to be living with and in love with the person that I like spending time with. But the thought or the idea of spending time with a different person, in physical proximity to another human being, it just feels so strange right now because it's just so far outside my experience.
Yeah, completely.
Mark, speaking of things that are so far outside my experience, my copy of Sonic Forces, would you like to borrow it? Would you like to try to borrow it? You can. All you gotta do is email us at Nintendo Cartridge Society at gmail.com and give us a mailing address where we can send it. There's a possibility that you will get a package that is not Sonic Forces. It might be some sort of sabotaging goose and a game that goes with it. But that is a total crapshoot. You've got no control over that. I've got no control over that. I've got some control over that. But you should still get involved, get on this list, and have fun or don't have fun.
It continues to be, yeah, really. And we hope that you choose to have fun. But as always with the Sonic Forces borrowing program, we can't force you.
No. Look, this is the thing about the Sonic Forces borrowing program. It can't tell you what to do at all. Have fun, don't have fun. Be sad, don't be sad. Play a game, don't play a game. These not the program's calls to make. They are your calls to make. It's a good program. We've talked it up enough. I think, Mark, we should probably get into our topic at hand. We're talking next generation features for Nintendo consoles. Now, Mark, why would we be doing this now? There's no new Nintendo thing coming out.
There is no new Nintendo thing coming out. But as we are recording this, we are sandwiched between the launch of the new Xbox consoles and the PlayStation 5 in all of its iterations. There is so much next-gen stuff happening right now.
So what we wanted to do was we wanted to get in on some of that next-gen hype and visit some previous next gens and talk about what sort of features, obviously all on the Nintendo side, but what sort of features meant that next gen leap for each of us. But before we get into what that usually means for Nintendo generations, I want to just talk about how Nintendo generational shifts are so different from the generational shifts of the two leading consoles right now. The PlayStation and the Xbox, because for all of them, it feels like the the actual leaps between generation are almost exclusively in computing power and graphical prowess, right? And that everything else from like the form of like the form and function of the machine is basically the same, and the biggest leaps come like within the generations.
Yeah,
You think that's
absolutely.
a fair way to characterize that?
I think the one time that that wasn't the case, or that they attempted for that to not be the case, was with the Xbox One when it originally, launched. I feel like they, in their own weird Microsoft way, were going for something that was much more Nintendo-esque, where they were like, "Hey, like Kinect is going to be like a huge, important primary focus of the Xbox One, and we're all about like being your living room hub
Yeah.
and not just a game machine." And like that tactic like didn't work at all, and they spent the entire generation basically trying to undo all the stuff that they had done leading up to launch. Connect was very quickly dropped, and the stuff about it being a hub, like that was also very quickly dropped. Um, but no, otherwise I think you're right. Like even going from, the I think PlayStation is a very clear example of that story. And Nintendo doesn't sometimes chooses to play that game, maybe chose to play that game in the past, but more
Yeah.
recently has not shown a lot of interest in playing that game.
Yeah, like in the last 2 decades, basically.
Yeah.
Not really playing that game at all. It is interesting to consider, like, how I mean, every company, with the exception of Microsoft and Sony, which seem to have like the exact same game plan, that like all the other companies had like varying approaches to like every generation of, like Atari, like the main controller interface was different on a lot of those systems. Sega went nuts. They had like divergent paths of like next generation, which did not end well for them. And then Nintendo just did. I mean, it kind of did everything, right? Like between like splitting itself off into two different paths, one handheld and one console, and like them sort of following their own discrete paths and then somehow merging up with the Switch is all very strange, but kind of cool.
Yeah, next gen stuff is always exciting. I feel like this one for me is coming at a weird time with like leading up to this launch. There's so much focus on, and continued to focus on the U.S. election, and with like COVID-19, like these launches are coming at such like a weird time. But I think it's actually kind of like a boon for Microsoft and Sony that they are coming now, because we've just seen video games just like explode during the
Yeah.
pandemic.
Yeah, people have been stuck at home and like, what were you going to do at home anyway but play video games?
Yeah.
It is I will be interested to see like numbers when we start getting numbers on actually, because it certainly does seem like uh not everyone but a ton of people are buying either the Xbox Series X or the PlayStation 5, and that a lot of people are also trying to but are being constrained by the limited supply. I wonder just how limited that supply actually is. You and I talked about this back in like February or something, that I was concerned that there wouldn't be enough supply, and I also said maybe even not enough demand. But this is before we really understood like, what coronavirus was going to do to people's media diets, and therefore their spending on entertainment stuff. Um, but yeah, I will be very interested to see how well these things actually sold. Obviously, they sell out, but like, how many are they even able to make at this point?
Yeah, I feel like launch month is always kind of like
Totally.
a misnomer, right? Because you're targeting the early adopters, like the people who are going to pick one up no matter what, because they're just like super invested in the product. I think, where we are in March will be just as interesting to learn.
Yeah, totally. And also, like, this isn't that different from the PlayStation 3 Wii generation, because both of those consoles were impossible to find when they came out.
Yeah, yeah,
So
totally.
like, it's the same thing. We just didn't have as widespread internet use documenting these things. So there you go. I mean, this is a slight sidetrack, but I remember this is when I was living in Appleton, Wisconsin, and the Switch came out. Not the Switch, the Wii came out. And I would go to like 2 different Walmarts, 2 different Targets, a Best Buy, and a Toys R Us, for opening every morning for like a week and a half, and then eventually I got a Wii. Like you had to put in some legwork.
Yeah, I mean, I remember doing this similar thing for the Nintendo DS Lite when that was released. I was looking for like the polar white one. And this was like the early days of like stores having their inventory listed online. So
Yeah.
it would say that like, hey, this Target has it in stock, but it was even more hit and miss than it is now. And so I did the same thing. I remember checking every day at like the Target that was just a few blocks from me, hoping for like a shipment to come in before I finally got one.
This is our version of those walking to school uphill both ways in the snow with no shoes.
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
that's our version of this. We had to check. This is the early days of being able to check inventory on the internet. But so we're gonna go through every generational shift for Nintendo products. Mark, do you want to do all the consoles first and then all the handhelds, or do you want to try and approach it all chronologically? What are you thinking here?
I could do it either way. The way I have my list broken out is by consoles and then handhelds. But if we want to like intermingle, I'm sure we could figure it out.
No, let's do consoles up to the Wii U, and then do handhelds, and then just talk about, and then do finish with the Switch.
Sounds great.
Okay, so the first generational shift for Nintendo handheld or Nintendo home consoles is, of course, the NES to the Super NES. Mark, would you like to go first and say what you found to be the like defining new feature for that shift?
Yeah, and so when I was thinking of these, I have to kind of like preamble this because Patrick and I haven't conferred lists at all, and so I don't know how like each of us approach this. For me, some of it was like looking back on it, where it's like, okay, now when I think about like my experience with that console, what really stands out compared to like the one before it. And
Yeah.
so I think like there's a lot that you could say for like the leap from the NES to the SNES. I think like the SNES with those 16 bits, you were really able to see, in my opinion, like the full vision of what people who worked on like 8-bit games, like it felt like they had this much bigger playground to play with, and so we saw like those same ideas but just elaborated to, I feel like, their fullest, just
Hmm.
like with the Final Fantasy games or with the original Legend of Zelda, and compared to A Link to the Past, where it's like we're playing with like these brand new tools that allow us to like show our vision in such high fidelity. But the thing that looking back like stands out to me as I think such a big generational shift from the NES to the Super NES is the sound chip that was in the Super Nintendo.
Rad.
Because
What a good point.
the music from the Super Nintendo is something that like sticks with me so much, and not just the compositions, not that the music itself, but the way that like it's based around samples. And the Super Nintendo has such a distinct sound. Like it always kind of sounds like it's being played underwater, and it has like just these really unique samples, like these weird like farty sounds that sound like a pig is being stepped on, that
Yep.
like the way I'm describing it, not appealing, but when you hear it, you're like, yeah, that is 100% the sound of the
Sweet,
Super
beautiful
Nintendo.
music. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is interesting, especially from like the evolution from the NES, which also has a very distinct sound chip set that like you hear an NES and you know that it's an NES, right? Like it just sounds like that. But it's in both graphics and sound, it does feel like the Super NES is able to like release some of the responsibility or like the weight placed on abstraction. Like the a tiny sprite in the original Final Fantasy barely looks like the thing it's trying to represent, right?
Right.
By the time you get to the Super NES ones, it actually does look like the thing. Ditto, like the string noises that that are supposed to be like a violin or a cello or whatever, they don't even come close on the NES, and it actually can, like, the thing can sound like the thing and the thing can look like the thing. So I think that's a really well observed point there,
It's
Mark.
also something that like I don't think that those days were better, because obviously being able to have like streaming audio and full orchestrations,
Yeah.
like adds a lot to a game. But there is something very unique to the time back then where every console had a distinct sound that you can like clearly identify because it was working from like discrete technology. Like there's something really cool about that. I don't think it's better,
Yeah.
but there is something that's like very cool.
Yeah, there's something very cool about like hearing a piece of music and being like, "Is this from Genesis?" And you're like, "Yes, it absolutely is."
Well, especially
Like,
when you
nothing else that makes it sound.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when like we were talking about like a lot of the newer consoles, right there, it is just about like everybody's kind of doing the same thing and they have like different ways of approaching the problem of like bigger games. But back then it was like, no, like we've crafted our console and it does this very unique like sound thing and none of the
Yeah.
other ones are going to do this.
You have to make your thing play our instrument.
Yeah.
That's all there is to it. Mark, I maybe went a little bit simpler with this one, and I feel almost a little bit silly reducing the Super NES to this, but buttons, baby. There are just more buttons on this controller. I'm not counting the start and select buttons because why would you ever count those as actual buttons? Those are like administrative buttons. If we remove those, the number of buttons increases by 200%. You will never see another generational leap where there are that many more buttons on the new controller. And it's just like all that does is facilitate, more interaction, more choices in your gaming. And like it sort of like opens up to a greater variety of types of games that you can play on the Super NES. So yeah, for me it's just buttons. Also pioneering those the bumpers, like that's incredible. Something that has obviously been replicated, and the sort of like cross formation of buttons on the for the right thumb, like that's on everything now. Like we've added thumbsticks and triggers, but like that's it. And like that's not that much to add in the last, I don't know, 25, 30 years.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. I like that a lot. I like the fact that um the when you think it is completely crazy to me thinking back on it that it wasn't until the Nintendo DS that we got 4 face buttons on
Yeah.
a portable system. Like that the Game Boy Advance still only has an A and B button is
It's
super
outrageous.
crazy, especially when you think that they were porting Super Nintendo games to the Game Boy Advance. But it is something that you take for granted. Like, it's we've never seen Nintendo use like that super branding ever again. But the Super Nintendo truly was like a super version of the NES from like
Totally.
graphics, from sound, from to the controller. Like it felt like a huge update. It wasn't like in some ways it was a refinement. Not to keep like comparing it to modern consoles, but
Yes.
with like the
But
the
that's probably
Xbox
the closest.
controller and like the PlayStation controller, those have generally been the same for like 2 or 3 generations now, and we continue to see refinements. But going from the NES to the Super Nintendo, like that felt like a generational leap.
Yeah. Well, and it is interesting. Like the biggest I think leap in PlayStation controllers happened in the PlayStation, like in the original PlayStation 1 generation with the introduction of the DualShock. Like that happened towards the end of its life cycle, and not like actually with a generational change, which is a weird little quirk of what happened there with Sony.
Well, speaking of which, should we move on to the SNES to N64 to Nintendo 64?
Let's do it. I'm gonna go first this time. Mine is still very controller related. This is Rumble Pack, baby. This is the first time that we are getting controller feedback, and that is again industry standard now, but also something that Nintendo continues to innovate on. And with HD Rumble and actually like designing mini game functions around the ability to tell how many ice cubes there are in the whatever marbles. Are they ice cubes? Who knows? Who cares? But it's, I mean, like HD Rumble is one of those things that now on Switch is like touted as one of the things that like is added to an indie game or something that's being ported over there. And you can tell that all of that is like that all traces its origins back to the original Rumble Pack, which was packed in with Star Fox 64. because they were just trying to do whatever they could to make that experience more immersive and different. And like truly, it's not that different of a gameplay experience than the Star Fox on Super Nintendo. But like everything that they can do to like make it feel like something more than just lights and sounds coming from a screen. That feedback, starts at the Nintendo 64.
My N64 one is also controller related, and this one is the analog stick.
Oh, that
Um,
analog stick.
yeah, so analog stick, obviously, like the first time that I think the first time it ever showed up in like a home console. It's crazy now how much we take these like analog sticks for granted. It's also crazy that Nintendo was the one to introduce the analog stick because uh we didn't get true dual analog from them until what? Like the Wii with the Pro controller?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, which is like wild. But like the analog stick was such a huge like revolution in game controllers that, like you said, Sony mid-generation was like, "Oh crap. We have to like
Oh, we need to do this.
we just have
Yeah.
to like change what controller we're using."
Yeah. I mean, the Nintendo 64 controller is such a strange beast, and was clearly just designed for Super Mario 64. And then also had this like D-pad hanging off the end of it, which is still just such an insane design. But like the C buttons, the camera buttons, they actually do control the camera, and like do a kind of effective job. I know obviously we've talked about the Mario 64 camera in the past, but like between those camera buttons and the analog stick, like that thing was designed to work with that game.
Yeah, it's just the N64 controller is bonkers. Like it's super crazy. You look at one, it doesn't make any sense how you're supposed to hold it. Like what it is not intuitive, I think, other than like having that analog stick, and you can imagine like Mario running around with it. But for like Nintendo taking their like first shots, or Nintendo being the first company to take shots at any of this stuff, like it's remarkable how well it does work. Like yeah, I
Yeah.
was playing Mario 64 on 3D All Stars, and I have a bunch of complaints about it. But when you think that like they were the first ones doing it, there's a lot more grace to be given, because you're like, well, that's kind of remarkable that you were able to get as close as you were.
Mark, I think interesting to note that neither of us brought up the move into 3D here, and I don't. Is it because that is that like why is that? Why is it that neither of us want to talk about like the jump into 3D? Is it because there are a lot of stumbling blocks here, or is it because like this is where other companies start to like show themselves to be stronger at something that Nintendo is doing? Why aren't we talking about this?
No, so for me, I think what it is, I mean, one, like, it is very clear that one of the big leaps from the Super Nintendo
Sure.
to the N64 is into like 3D graphics. But I also think that for me, some of it is just that like graphics are not something that Nintendo has prioritized. Like
Yeah.
The in modern times, in the
Yeah.
past, it mattered a ton, and that like 64 bits, it was a big enough selling point that it was in the name, even though as a kid I had no idea what like that meant, and still probably could not accurately tell you what it means that it had 64 bits. So
Oh,
yeah,
what a great point. Do the bits at that point even matter? Because it's processing polygons at that point, right? Like
yeah, like I don't know.
I
I
don't know.
couldn't tell
I
you.
don't know.
But it just seems like now, like looking back on it, that it is for sure 3D was a huge deal, but like Nintendo deprioritizes like graphical
Hmm.
prowess, and so I guess I'm just taking my cues from them.
Yeah, but I mean, they did do a good job of like putting their franchises that were traditionally 2D into 3D. Like that is something, and even as I'm saying it, like really just with Zelda and Mario, like everything else was pretty much staying the course. Like Star Fox was 3D before. Uh, everything else kind of stayed 2D. So I don't know. Maybe that's why, is that the only real examples are Mario and Zelda. Okay, Mark, the next generational leap from Nintendo 64 to GameCube. What do you have as the next gen feature?
So for me, this one, the GameCube was the console where like the promise of the N64, the promise of those 3D games could finally take form. Like I
Yeah,
think that the GameCube is really like truly the start of like modern the GameCube generation. So GameCube, Xbox, PlayStation 2, like that is the start of modern games and really like the foundation of modern games. Like in order for like you were saying, like in order for Nintendo to bring some of their titles from the Super Nintendo to the N64, they did have to make compromises, or at least they had to like cheat it a little bit, right? Like it wasn't
totally.
true 3D. Like Mario Kart 64, those are 2D sprites essentially, um, that give you the illusion of 3D. But that was no longer the case with the GameCube. Like they were able to take the ambitions in the N64 and like actually fulfill them to give you these like fully rendered worlds. Same with like I feel like Smash Brothers is another great example. You know, like the
Totally.
Smash Brothers on the N64 is feels like a tech demo compared to Smash Brothers Melee, and all the other Smash Brothers games are really like iterating on Melee more than they are like the original. And that
Yeah,
to me is like
100%.
the GameCube is like the fulfillment of like the promise of the 3D that started in the N64 era.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought that the GameCube is sort of the Super Nintendo 64. Like that it is just taking what it was sort of like they were messing around with and being like, okay, no, but here's what it looks like. You know, like here's the real thing. I went a slightly different path with this, and I said that this is where the console generation connects and marries itself to the handheld. So the GameCube had a bunch of different functionality with the Game Boy Advance and with Game Boy Advance games. There is the Game Boy Player, which was the thing that you could kind of like put under your GameCube, and then play Game Boy Advance games on your TV. Which had sort of been done with the Super Game Boy on the Super NES, but that was really more like to get more mileage out of the like color upscaling that the Game Boy Color was capable of, and just like here's one more way for them to sell it. Here it's it's the real deal. You can play any GBA games on your TV, any Game Boy games. So there's all of that, and then there's also the Four Swords Adventure stuff of being able to control, and Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, where you are physically connecting your Game Boy Advance to your GameCube to play games with everyone having their own little screen in front of them. And this like it's so interesting to me how much like the paths for the Nintendo consoles are sort of divergent, but keep sort of like tagging up with each other. And this is one place where it just like tags up really hard. And the Game Boy Advance, which is basically just like a portable Super Nintendo, except with fewer buttons, also is like a GameCube controller. Like it's so weird.
Yeah, that is really cool. And I like the way that you're describing it where it's like a an infinity pattern basically where
Yes.
these like the Nintendo consoles like converge but then we always keep coming back to like this same singular point in like a good way, in an iterative way.
Yes. Um okay, so the next generation here is the GameCube to the Wii. Mark, I will go first this time. For me, this was about changing the gaming experience to a personalized experience, and that is present in what you select for like your news channels to follow. The weather is set to where you are, but mostly this comes in the form of Mii's. You make Mii's because you want to see yourself in the game, and otherwise like you're playing Wii Sports and like who are these characters, and you're playing Wii Sports with everyone. You're playing it with every friend you have. You're playing it with your mom. You're playing it with grandma. You're playing it with your friends' parents when they come over. Like, and you are just populating this thing with Mii's that look like the people from your life. And then Nintendo wasn't content to just be like, yeah, those will be in Wii Sports, and that's it. They show up in like Mario Kart, just like hanging out in the background. And like they are a constant presence, and a constant like proof that the game has been customized to your very specific experience. And like I know Xbox maybe a little later in like the 360 generation started doing like those avatars, but I don't think those avatars ever like showed up in like regular games, like maybe in Connect specific things or stuff like that. But like Nintendo would just put them everywhere. Your friends and family are in not all your games, but a lot of your games.
Yeah, one of the not Wii specific, but Mii's were such like a fun part of Nintendo that once when they're like missing from the Switch, and missing in quotes because they're like
Because they're
buried in,
there. Right.
you can use them occasionally, but just like, man, I loved on the Nintendo 3DS like the Mii Plaza, and just being
We
able to
will
like,
get to the 3DS. We will
okay.
get there. Mark, I promise you, we'll have an
But yeah,
opportunity to discuss
just like
that.
plus one to Mii's. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
For my Wii one, I of course want to tip my hat to motion controls. That is like obviously a huge important piece that had seismic implications for the industry. But it's not the one I want to talk about. What I feel like it's a little bit like moving to 3D for the N64, where you're like, okay, yes, that obviously, was a huge
duh,
deal.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about something else. And for me, that is the virtual console.
Oh,
It is
yes.
something that has gone away in some respects, but or like in that specific form. But that idea of having access to a library of older Nintendo titles is something that is, for me, like pretty magical. Like the ability to play like these old games on the virtual console, to be able to experience games that like were showing up in the US for the first time, like Sin and Punishment, like all that kind of stuff I thought was so cool. And I still miss having a virtual console on Switch, even though I enjoy the things that they've done to replace it, like the NES Online and the SNES Online. But yeah, just having the access to all of those library titles, not just from Nintendo, but from a bunch of third parties, was such
Yeah,
like
a
a
ton.
cool, amazing feature.
It was also like right. It came out at like the perfect time for that too, where like we were just far enough away from like the NES and the SNES that like your hardware was probably starting to stop working, or like games were hard to find, or like would cost a lot of money because they're rare or whatever. And like it was just the right relationship between you couldn't access them anymore, but you wanted to experience them again. And then also like fairly recent stuff. Like I played the original Paper Mario on the Wii Virtual Console, like right when it came out. They're like maybe within the year of the Wii coming out. And like that was a great like full game experience at a time when like you weren't really downloading full games anywhere, right? Like even that was a little bit of a novelty. The fact that they were old games were just kind of like cool icing on the top.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. Like when the Wii was coming out and the virtual console started, it was the perfect sweet spot for that NES like 20-year nostalgia cycle, because at that point, yeah, you were like almost exactly 20 years out from the release of like Super Mario Brothers.
Yeah. And like it's funny, like I associate the GameCube with some of the like collections of older games that I bought on it. Like there was a Mega Man collection. There was also maybe a Mega Man X collection as well, and a Sonic the Hedgehog collection that I really liked. And I think had Sonic 3 on it, which may be the last time that Sonic 3 was like collected on something. But in any event, it was just nice to have these things like kind of piecemeal, and like you could buy what you wanted instead of buying 8 games you didn't, so you could get one that you did. All right, Mark, next up is the Wii to the Wii U. Can you do this one? This is a tricky one.
No, so this was when I was taking like a kind of like minor Nintendo sabbatical. So I never owned a Wii U. I'm kind of bowing out of this one. So I'm interested to hear what you have.
So I just put that this is like Nintendo committing to the idea or sort of acknowledging the reality that we live in a high definition world, and that the box just needs to be stronger. And it's not something that we talk a lot that like Nintendo is not trying to keep up on the same metrics that everyone else is. But this is one point where they were like, okay, but we do have to keep up somehow. Like we have to get close to what everyone else is doing. And so like the high definition thing, and also like trying to incorporate itself explicitly into like other entertainment media. Remember the Wii U originally sold itself as like a TV companion where
Hmm.
you could watch like your cable TV and like flag shows and stuff, and like have a second screen experience using the Wii U gamepad, which all like sounds kind of neat, but is also like why you have a phone, like you can use a phone and a regular remote controller to just have that experience. But like I don't know, one of the things I remember being really cool about the early days of the Wii U was using it as a remote control for my TV. Like I would turn the TV on from the Wii U gamepad, which is that stupid? 100%. But like it was trying to incorporate itself into the living room in the same way that the Xbox One was with Kinect. And just like Kinect, that didn't work. But it's sort of the commitment to being technologically sound and having the capacity to do HD graphics and stuff that I think Nintendo obviously needed to do. Um, Game releases were kind of slow during that time, partially because Nintendo was like, "Oh shoot, it takes a lot of time and effort and money to develop for HD," and like they cut their teeth on it then, and now they're like up to speed and can actually do it on Switch and whatever comes after that. But I really think it's the Wii U is like the power generation.
Yeah, that's a great one. Like you're right that the Wii U is such like a teething console for Nintendo.
Yeah,
So it was kind of painful, but like had to go through it. Because with like you're right, with like HD graphics, it was a total like catch up generation. But then also, like with the gamepad and how it was like so close to delivering on the promise of the Switch, like so close
I
to being able
know.
to like play games, like in a handheld mode and also on the TV. Like it does it, but just it's not quite to the level that like where it's free of the restrictions of like the technology. And yeah, so a lot of like the painful groundwork that from the Wii U would pay off with the Switch for sure.
Yeah, I mean it the Wii U, and Switch, like that trio of consoles is so interesting. Cuz like, we've talked already about how a bunch of these consoles are really just like leveled up versions of the previous one. And in a way the Wii U is just a leveled up Wii. Like it is doing that, but it's also trying a couple of things, and like the other stuff that it tries like it's the early version of that, So like they're still taking on the sort of like toyetic aesthetic of the Wii remotes, something that's like plastic and like a toy, and sort of building it into the gamepad. And the gamepad can't feel like a toy; it has to feel like technology, which is what the Switch feels like. But we are going to get to what the switch to from the Wii U to the Switch means after we do the handhelds. So Mark, I realize only now that we did not specify whether we are starting with Game Boy to Game Boy Color or Game Boy to Game Boy Advance. So, what did you do?
I skipped over the Game Boy Color. I went straight from the Game Boy to the Game Boy
My man,
Advance. I think Game Boy Color we can acknowledge the big advancement. Color.
Color. Yep, very good, very good. Also, just came alongside a nice just like hardware revision in general. Um, and obviously now I'm can't remember the actual chronology of, did the Game Boy Pocket come out before the Game Boy Color? Was the
I
Game Boy
don't
Color Pocket?
think so. I think they were contemporaries, maybe around the
Okay,
same time.
there's no way to know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, so should I start with my Game Boy
Please.
to Game Boy Advance? Okay, so mine advancement that I want to call out for the Game Boy Advance is backwards compatibility.
Very good.
So the Game Boy Advance could play Game Boy carts, um, just
Every
like
single
it
one.
could every single one. And so it's something that we kind of take for granted now, even though it wasn't until the Wii generation that Nintendo consoles started being backwards compatibility. backwards compatible, and something that you can't take for granted because, like with the Switch, like it's not always going to be that way as technology changes. But the handhelds, Nintendo has from the beginning fairly consistently just had backwards compatibility, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that every generation, especially from the Game Boy Advance to the DS, that's the one where it's like insane that there's like it just like a big plug that you can pull out so you can jam a GBA card in there.
Yeah.
Um, so for me, and I think it's also really smart that they did backwards compatibility for that, and I wonder if a lot of that is driven by Pokemon. A lot of the
Oh, that's
advancements
interesting.
in handhelds are probably driven by Pokemon and what they either what audiences they need to continue to be able to serve, and what audiences are sort of demanding, because like people were still playing gold and silver, to say nothing of red and blue and yellow, when the GBA came out, and would continue to like it's a competitive scene,
Yeah. No, that's a really good point because like the Game Boy Advance also supported link cables. So you could
Yes.
use like Game Boy link cables on the Game Boy Advance. And I'm sure you're right that that was brought forward for Pokemon because what other game would like really require it? I mean, later the Game Boy Advance would get like the wireless accessory that you could like transfer
Yeah, yeah,
Pokemon and
yeah.
stuff wirelessly, but yeah, it always supported the link cable as well.
So I, for the Game Boy to Game Boy Advance generational leap, I wrote non-arcade experiences, and I guess this can also just be sort of applied to non-handheld game experiences. I think that there's obviously a lot of great stuff on the original Game Boy, and some truly deep experiences, like the Mana game, what is it, Final Fantasy Legend, or no, Final Fantasy Adventure, also Final Fantasy Legend, also the original Pokemon games. But for the most part, the original Game Boy games are all sort of like very good Game and Watch experiences. Like they're single side scrolling, or like falling block puzzle or Arkanoid or whatever. There's just there's so many of the original Game Boy experiences that are quick. They are meant to be like handheld, bite-sized sort of things, and then you move on to another experience. Even something like Super Mario Land is a short game, right? And in the Game Boy Advance, that's when they're like, no, you know what? Forget it. It's just a video game machine. So like, put games on it. Put the Minish Cap on there. Start porting the Super Nintendo Final Fantasy games. Let's all of that. It just becomes a much like deeper experience that they expect you to be in for longer.
Yeah, like just like we saw with the NES to SNES, the ambition from like the 8-bit
Yeah.
games, and what was possible in that like 8-bit system and 16-bit system, like was doubly true on the Game Boy to Game Boy Advance because the Game Boy was like such ancient technology by the
Yes.
time that the Game Boy Advance came out. So like the difference between what you could achieve on a Game Boy versus a Game Boy Advance was staggering.
Yeah, and I mean, like, truly staggering, and also like considering like your original Game Boy took 4 AA batteries, four. The Game Boy Advance ran on 2, and lasted for as long. Guess I don't totally remember. I have a Game Boy Advance in the other room. It has the same batteries it's had in it since I lived in Chicago. Like, I hope it's still okay. Okay, so from the Game Boy Advance to the DS, this is a big generational leap. Lots of things are different here, and maybe not even fair to consider them the same line of things. Like, it came out while the GBA was still thriving, and Nintendo was touting at that point a third pillar. But for me, the biggest innovation here is just touch. Touch control, being able to draw on that bottom screen, and it just changes the types of games that you can play. Suddenly you're playing games where you are writing things, identifying numbers, circling stuff, and it's just it just changes the game entirely. What you can do with it, may not seem remarkable now in an era where we all have touchscreens on everything, but especially on the phones that we have in our pockets all the time. But it wasn't the case then, and that it for me it is the touch that transformed the DS.
Yeah, and it was really cool to see like how that like touch ability was used, right? Like Zelda like the Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks both like took advantage of it. And then you have like completely different ways of using it, like Professor Layton or the brain training games or
Yep,
that ninja gating game where like you had to hold it sideways like a book.
like
Like
a book. Yeah. Well, which
yeah.
is also like Brain Age too, where you were holding it sideways like a book. Mark, do you remember there were two different Mario games? It must have been New Super Mario Brothers and Super Mario Brothers 64 on the DS. That had just like a set of mini games in it that were all touch based. Do you remember these?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, for
Uh,
sure.
I played the heck out of those, and they're just they are time wasters for sure, but like are super fun, and it's all touch based.
My pick for the DS is Nintendo Wi-Fi connection.
Yes,
Hard,
huge.
yeah, huge. Hard to believe that like the first Nintendo hardware that had uh like a networking app that used Wi-Fi or that you could like connect with friends was
Yes.
the Nintendo DS. The GameCube had LAN abilities, so technically you could like LAN a bunch of systems together and play Mario Kart on it. I am sure that it happened at some point, but like I never knew anybody who also owned a GameCube, so it
Yeah,
was
fair enough.
like it wasn't really a possibility. But yeah, like I have so many fond memories of playing Mario Kart DS. Still one of my favorite Mario Kart games. And part of that was because of Nintendo Wi-Fi connection and being able to like race people online using a handheld felt so
Yes.
novel and like so of the future.
Yeah, I remember going to this is while I was in college. My friend Siri and I both had DSs, and we would go to like the local coffee shop because it had wireless, and we would race in Mario Kart online. Her on her pink DS Lite, and me on my glacier white DS Lite. Um, Man, it was just it felt like the future, you know.
Well, this is another one of those like, hey, we're where you realize like how long ago the DS was because like Wi-Fi at the time was available, but it still was not like ubiquitous,
Yeah.
even in homes. So Nintendo also released like a adapter that basically you could plug into your computer, and so if your computer had internet, then it
Wow.
would like broadcast and turn it into like a Wi-Fi hotspot that your DS could pick up on, and like it would that was a way that a lot of people were able to like make that connection. And so the fact that like Nintendo, who was kind of derided in the GameCube era, towards the end of the GameCube era, for not having like an Xbox Live equivalent as that sort of come online with like Halo 2, um, to go from that jumping all the way to the Nintendo DS where they're like, hey, we're like just a straight up Wi-Fi company was pretty forward thinking of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so for the next generation leap, I'm just going to expand on this. But from the DS to the 3DS, what I've chosen to focus on here is, of course, not the glasses-less 3D, but the constant connectivity, asynchronous multiplayer, and Street Pass. Um, I don't think there has been a Nintendo system ever as like insistent on its own like connection to the internet as the 3DS. It comes built in with a bunch of games that just want you to carry the thing around so it can acknowledge the existence of other 3DSs out in the wild. Um, it's a whole suite of little games that you can play with your Mii's, with other people's Mii's, with stats that you borrow from other people that you're walking by. It's incredible. And also just to consider the multiplayer like that's sort of built in to 3DS game experiences. I know neither of us have ever played Metroid Prime Federation Forces, but like that and Triforce Heroes Legend of Zelda are both games that came out like pretty late that require you to play with other people. like Nintendo doesn't do that. I guess like Splatoon is maybe the counterexample, but that's got a very like sort of easy to understand, like you just drop in and like, play against people sort of like that's all very obvious. The 3DS was not obvious. But it just wanted you to be connecting with people. It wanted you to be borrowing their information. It wanted you to let other people borrow your information. Even something like Smash, Super Smash Brothers for 3DS had like a weird like Pog-esque like mini game that you could play that you picked up like other people's Street Pass information, and it was very strange. There was like a flicking component to it. Did you ever play this thing?
No, no.
It was very weird. And didn't make a whole lot of sense. It wasn't super fun, but the insistence on this connectivity and the sort of asynchronous multiplayer is so unique on the 3DS. So that's my generational leap.
Yeah, the I am sad that when I I still have my Nintendo 3DS, but I am sad that I don't live in a place where I like had to commute a bunch, or not commute, but like on a train, or be in a
Yes.
place where like lots of people were. Because getting the only time that I ever really got to like experience that joy was when I was traveling through an airport, and so
Yes.
like I would have my 3DS on in sleep mode in my backpack while I was traveling in airports, just because I knew that was my best chance of getting like other Mii's through Street Pass.
Yep.
But also like to your point of like the 3DS being built as a system that wants you to like interact with other people, and it is totally a portable that wants you to take it places, because it even had like a pedometer in it. Like you got
Yeah, that's right.
rewards for like taking steps during the day. It was a system that like wanted you to be on the move.
Yeah, it's so interesting, man. I wish I'd been in some kind of school when that thing came
That
out.
would have been, yeah.
It would have been such a fun like college thing. Would have been like a great high school. Oh my gosh, it would have been fun.
My pick for the 3DS, it goes back to controls. It goes back to the circle pad.
Circle Pad Pro.
Again, like we are talking about a Nintendo console within the past, like 10 years, and that is the first one that had any sort of like
Wow.
analog control on a handheld. It was a big deal. It was still just kind of a half step, but I think like as we're converging here at the end of this discussion, it's kind of an appropriate place to land.
Yeah, no, that is so interesting, and also the control scheme for the 3DS is very strange, right? Because it's got the two sets of it's got like bumpers and triggers, but they're not really triggers. It's just like another set of bumpers. And like the new 3DS has like that little nub that like can only be used in a couple games as like kind of a joystick. The circle pad is also weird cuz like nothing else uses input
Mhm.
like that. Like it's not quite an analog stick. Um and then, obviously it still had like the touch and like sound inputs like everything else. And also the two cameras on the front so it could take 3D pictures. Like there was just a lot of weird stuff going on there. A lot of weird ways to give that device information.
It had a little bit of the Wii U problem that we talked about during our like review of E3 conferences, and like the Wii U reveal was like you could tell it was just them throwing stuff at the wall, and like even they weren't sure what was going to stick. And the 3DS, they came in with a very clear vision of like, hey, it's glassesless 3D, it's glassesless 3D, but they also like you're saying, like there was so much stuff else in the system that they're like, we're including it. It doesn't seem like we really have a plan for what like the value proposition of this stuff is, but it's going to be there.
So speaking of like lots of extra features and like possibly valueless propositions, we have not yet mentioned dual screen experiences as like core to any of these games, even though it was a feature of the Wii U, the DS, and the 3DS, and has not been a feature of any other console or handheld.
That's true. I was in my mind, I was kind of when you gave the nod on the DS to the touchscreen, I was kind of counting that as
Counting
talking
that.
about the dual screen experience. Although like they're not exactly the same thing. Some games use like the bottom screen for stuff that didn't necessarily require touch, or at least the touch was like not like a core
Yeah.
component of it. But yeah, I mean that's a good point. It did leave a really big mark on a good chunk of like modern Nintendo, and something that it doesn't seem like we're going to have any like elaboration on in the future.
Which means that a lot of games are going, and versions of games are going to be sort of stranded on those platforms for maybe ever.
Yeah.
It's the biggest loss there, and this is so stupid and easily like navigated around. But like Zelda games, 3D Zelda games benefited so much from putting the entirety of your menu on the lower screen, and you could just interact with it and then like glance back up at the main screen and just keep playing, like the Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask 3D remakes, and the ones on Wii U, Wind
Twilight
Waker and
Princess
Twilight
and Wind
Princess.
Waker.
Yeah. We're just like it is my preferred way to interact with a Zelda game and its menus, and we're never gonna we're never gonna see that again.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to admit, as much as I enjoy playing Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, I sure miss the honk button.
Oh, love that big honk button. I forgot that that's what it was. Yeah, I mean it was also frequently like the thing that ruined a game. The Diddy Kong Racing port for DS had these little like mini games at the start of every race that were just like the, get off the starting line fast, like the boost at the beginning of Mario Kart.
Hmm.
Um and it depended on what vehicle you were in, what the game was. But there was like one of it, I think for the hovercraft, where you had to like use the stylus to like draw a circle as fast as you could, to like get the propeller going, and then you boost it off the thing, and then you had the stylus in your hand, but you need to like throw it away to like start actually playing the game normally. It was a total mess. All right, Mark, that brings us of course to the Switch. Now, how did you consider this? Did you consider this the Wii U to the Switch, the 3DS to the Switch? What how did you approach this?
Yeah, this one I found challenging. Kind of what I went back to was Nintendo's Switch reveal presentation from January of 2017, and um, at the time and when we were rewatching it at the end of our E3 like historical reviews, um, it was a part of the presentation that I kind of laughed at, but I it's hard for me to pinpoint one specific thing basically because I really do feel like the Switch is a convergence of like so much of Nintendo's consoles. Like
Yes.
it's taking from so many of these like generational leaps and putting it into a single system.
Yeah, absolutely. I chose freedom here, that like and this is something that we talked about when we did our if this year was the year of Luigi, what other years have Nintendo? And 2017 just being the year of freedom, because you play the Switch and you play it however you want. You play it in front of you play it on the TV, you play it at the park, you play it on the bus, whatever. And the first big game you're playing on it is The Legend of Zelda, the ultimate like play it how you want, travel and explore what directions you want to, prioritize whatever equipment you want to, play the game the way you want to play it. And then later that year, still within like the sort of expanded launch window of Mario Odyssey being in there too. Like the Switch is all about you being able to have the experience with it that you want. And like remarkably, between Nintendo's amazing first party support, especially in the first like 3-ish years of the thing being out, and indie games just work so well on this thing and sell so well on this thing that it is like a thriving platform for them. So like you can play whatever kind of games you want on the Switch. They're all there. With the exception of like the big AAA stuff coming out of like the other game studios. And I guess that is a pretty big exception. But there are a lot of opportunities to play a lot of different things a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I mean it's like I have the same for what I'm about to say, which is that the Switch is a system that feels like it has few compromises. Like I won't say no compromises because
Absolutely.
because it does, and it doesn't have like the power to run like a Assassin's Creed Odyssey or something like that, right? And so that is for sure something that it is limited at. But at the same token, you look back on a lot of these consoles and they are Nintendo making like trade-offs, right? They're saying no, we
Yeah.
are going to prioritize A over B, X over Y. And the Switch feels like less of a compromise system. It feels like they have like made those choices in the past and now like they don't so much have to like say okay because we're focusing on this we're not paying attention to this. The Switch kind of feels like it has it all caveat other than like the power to run like a lot of these like third party games, but I think it'll get there to a point eventually, maybe not the Switch
Yeah.
itself but like the iterations on it.
Yeah, and that's sort of what I'm expecting now. And when I say now, I mean within the next couple years of like, um, there will be some sort of iteration on the Switch, and like that's going to be a stronger version of it that can more closely, kind of just do what the console generation that is disappearing now, can do. But it'll what the thing that it'll start to be able to do is incorporate now like a new line of backwards compatibility. One of the things that is a bummer about the Switch is that unlike the 3DS and unlike the Wii U, it couldn't play games from earlier generations. And like we still get kind of excited when we see however it's happening, either like Capcom is bringing Resident Evil 4 to the Switch, or the SNES Switch Online or whatever. Like they have to come up with solutions for every single old game to get on the system, where there was like a sort of baked in hardware way to do that for all these other ones. And I just pray that the next Switch has that in mind and is like I want to be able to play my copy of Breath of the Wild on whatever they put out next.
Yeah, I completely agree. My hope is that like the purchases that we've made on the eShop on like the Switch will continue to like roll forward and it'll just be like one
Yeah.
ecosystem. One thing that I think is interesting when we're talking about like what Nintendo's next console looks like is in previous generations, like Nintendo made a big decision with the Wii to prioritize like the motion controls, but then we saw other companies like copy motion controls, so that wasn't unique to Nintendo anymore. So Nintendo's next console had to be like something different, right?
Yeah.
It had to be like the Wii U, and because they had people like copying them, they had to continue to like innovate in that way. We haven't really seen Microsoft or Sony have any interest in this hybrid model that Nintendo has tapped into. Like, yes,
Yeah.
we do see Sony and Microsoft especially, like going into this idea of like being able to play games on wherever you want on any form factor with like Game Pass and XCloud, but it's a
And
different
even on
model.
PlayStation with like remote play that you can do that on your phone.
Right. And so it's like it's that same idea of like you can play anywhere but from a different tact. And so the fact that Nintendo has this kind of like hybrid space a little bit to themselves, it makes me think that it's possible that the next generation of Nintendo console will continue to be in this vein. Never say never, like Nintendo may decide they want to do something completely different in the
Right.
future. But this more than like the Wii U era, like it makes sense to me that they don't feel the need to like completely reinvent themselves.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also, like, we talked about it from the NES to the Super NES. Like, it's kind of just a plussed up version. Ditto the Game Boy to Game Boy Advance and the N64 to the GameCube. The Switch to whatever comes next will likely just be a better version of what we're currently playing with. And we'll spend $350 on it or something. Also crazy that the price of the Switch hasn't dropped at all in 4 years, huh?
Yeah, crazy, but also not not that surprising.
Yeah. I guess that's fair. Nintendo does like to keep the price of their stuff high, and it's been selling like nuts, so why would they even bother? Okay, that's what we identified as all of the big generational leaps for Nintendo consoles. If you have something that you think we left out, keeping in mind that we did acknowledge going to 3D with the Nintendo 64, You can write to us at Nintendo Cartridge Society at gmail.com.
gmail.com.
And let us know. We would love to hear from you. All right, Mark, let's close this out. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society. Remember, please rate, review, subscribe, and all that good stuff on Apple Podcasts. If you like the episode, please share it wherever you share stuff, Facebook or Twitter or, wherever. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm at Patrick_Ellers. Mark is at MKE Mitchell, and the show is at Nin Cart Society. We also have a Facebook page, which is just Nintendo Cartridge Society. Olivia Duncan Mayer logo. Our theme music is provided by Ape Betty. You can get more of his music by going to apebetty.com or by listening right now. For my co-host, Mark Mitchell, this is Patrick Ellers saying, we get it. 3D was obviously a big deal. We didn't mean to downplay it. Now we want to talk about it. Thank you for listening.
I'm Kate Thompson.
And I'm Mark David Christensen. And together we host Crap, a Hellboy podcast.
The show dedicated to the half-demon hero brought forth by writer-artist Mike Mignola and published by Dark Horse Comics.
Each week we discuss everything Hellboy.
Plus his expanded universe with the BPRD, Abe Sapien, Lobster Johnson, and many more.
That's Crap, a Hellboy podcast on Campfire Media or wherever you get your podcasts.
Campfire.